August 7th, 1942. 0613 hours. The Solomon Islands. 19,000 United States Marines crouched in landing craft, engines rumbling as they approached an island most Americans had never heard of. Guadalcanal, a speck of jungle and volcanic ridges in the South Pacific that would become the proving ground for American military power in World War II. 8 months after Pearl Harbor, America was about to transition from defensive victim to offensive warrior. What happened over the next 6 months on this remote island would determine whether the United States could stop Imperial Japan's seemingly unstoppable expansion across the Pacific. This wasn't just another battle. This was America's first major offensive operation of the entire war. The first time American forces would seize territory from an enemy that had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific. The first test of whether American industrial might could translate into battlefield victory against battle-hardened Japanese forces. The stakes were absolute. Failure meant Japanese bombers would threaten Australia. Success meant the beginning of the long road to Tokyo. But before we discover how American Marines transformed from green troops into hardened warriors, tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with history enthusiasts worldwide who understand that the Pacific War's outcome was decided in the jungles and waters around this one strategic island. To understand why 19,000 Americans were about to storm ashore on an island 3,000 miles from Hawaii, we need to understand the strategic disaster facing the United States in early 1942. Pearl Harbor had devastated the Pacific Fleet. The Philippines fell in May after a brutal campaign. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore all conquered. The Dutch East Indies, with its vital oil resources, seized. Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Most critically, Japanese forces were pushing toward Australia, America's last major Allied base in the Southwest Pacific. They'd established bases in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, building airfields that brought northern Australia within bomber range. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, understood the threat. If Japan secured the Solomons and isolated Australia, the entire Southwest Pacific would become a Japanese lake. Any counteroffensive would take years longer, cost countless more lives. The counter-argument came from across the Atlantic. General George Marshall and the Army staff wanted America First policy focused on defeating Nazi Germany. Every soldier, every ship sent to the Pacific meant fewer resources for the European theater. The debate raged through spring 1942 until intelligence reports changed everything. Coast watchers, Australian scouts operating behind Japanese lines, reported construction activity on Guadalcanal. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed it. Japan was building an airfield. This changed the strategic calculus entirely. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal would allow Japanese bombers to strike shipping lanes between America and Australia. It would provide fighter cover for further Japanese expansion. Most critically, it would make any Allied offensive in the Solomons exponentially more difficult. Admiral King presented the case to the Joint Chiefs. The airfield was still incomplete. Japanese defenses were minimal. A small, quick operation could seize it before it became operational. Once secured, American forces could turn it against the Japanese, using it as a base for operations up the Solomon Island chain. President Roosevelt approved Operation Watchtower on July 2, 1942. The 1st Marine Division would conduct the assault. They had exactly 5 weeks to prepare for the most important amphibious operation since Gallipoli. The man chosen to lead this unprecedented operation was Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division. Vandegrift was 55, a veteran of interventions in Mexico and Nicaragua, but like everyone in the American military, he had never commanded anything approaching the scale of what he was about to attempt. His division was scattered across the Pacific. The 1st and 5th Marine Regiments were in New Zealand. The 7th Marines were still in Samoa. Equipment was short. Training was incomplete. Intelligence about Guadalcanal was virtually non-existent. But there was no time. Japanese construction crews were working around the clock on that airfield. Every day's delay meant stronger defenses, more aircraft, greater casualties when the assault finally came. Vandegrift established his headquarters in Wellington, New Zealand, and began the frantic work of preparing for combat. Maps were outdated or non-existent. The best intelligence came from Australian coast watchers and a few pre-war traders who'd operated in the Solomons. They described Guadalcanal as 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, covered in jungle so thick you couldn't see 50 feet, infested with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and home to crocodiles, land crabs, and tropical diseases. The airfield under construction sat on a flat plain near Lunga Point on the northern coast. Intelligence estimated 2,000 Japanese defenders, mostly construction troops with limited combat capability. This estimate would prove catastrophically wrong, but nobody knew that yet. The assault force assembled at sea was unprecedented in American history. 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 14 cruisers, 31 destroyers, 23 transport ships carrying 19,000 Marines and their equipment. This was the largest amphibious operation in American history to that point, and it was being thrown together in weeks against an enemy that had been preparing for war since 1931. August 7, 1942. Dawn broke over Guadalcanal with tropical suddenness, the sun rising blood-red through morning haze. Aboard the transport, USS George F. Elliott, Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 1st Marine Regiment stood at the rail, watching the island emerge from darkness. Jungle-covered ridges, volcanic peaks wreathed in clouds, and that flat coastal plain where the airfield lay. The naval bombardment began at 0614 hours. The cruiser USS Quincy opened fire, her 8-inch guns hurling shells into the jungle near Lunga Point. Other ships joined, the thunder rolling across the water, explosions blossoming in the tree line. At 0650, dive bombers from the carriers roared over, adding their bombs to the preparation. The noise was incredible, a physical pressure that made ears ring even miles offshore. In the landing craft, Marines checked weapons for the 10th time, adjusted packs, tried to quiet nerves that jangled with adrenaline and fear. Most had never been in combat. Many were teenagers. All understood they were about to attempt something unprecedented, seizing territory from an enemy that hadn't lost land combat in this war. The first wave hit Beach Red at 0909 hours, an hour behind schedule due to confusion in loading the boats. Marines stumbled onto the beach expecting the worst. Machine gun fire, artillery, the horror stories they'd heard about Japanese banzai charges. Instead, they found empty beach. No defenders. No resistance. Just jungle and silence broken only by the crash of surf and the rumble of landing craft engines. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later win the Medal of Honor on this island, recalled the eerie landing. "We expected hell. We got nothing. Just empty beach and those trees staring at us like they were waiting for something." The Marines pushed inland cautiously, weapons ready, eyes scanning jungle that could hide an army. But the Japanese weren't there. The construction crews and their small security force had abandoned the airfield area and fled into the jungle when the bombardment started. By afternoon, elements of the 5th Marine Regiment secured the airfield intact. Vandegrift walked the half-finished runway, surveying his prize. Construction equipment sat abandoned. Supplies were stacked in neat rows. The Japanese had fled so quickly they'd left everything behind, including rice still warm in cooking pots. "Gentlemen," Vandegrift told his staff, "we've just become the landlords of the most strategically important airfield in the South Pacific. Now we have to hold it." That would prove infinitely harder than taking it. The landing wasn't entirely unopposed. Japanese float planes from Tulagi across the channel attacked the invasion fleet throughout the day. But Marine F-4F Wildcat fighters from the carriers shot down most attackers. The real threat came from the north. At Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, 565 miles northwest, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa received word of the American landing. His reaction was swift and aggressive. He immediately ordered an airstrike and began assembling a naval force to destroy the invasion fleet. At 13 to 30 hours, radar operators on the American ships picked up incoming aircraft. 27 Betty bombers escorted by 18 Zero fighters, all from the 25th Air Flotilla based at Rabaul. The resulting air battle became the first major test of American carrier aviation in offensive operations. F-4F Wildcats from USS Saratoga and USS Enterprise intercepted the Japanese formation 40 miles from the fleet. The Zeros were superior aircraft in most respects, faster, more maneuverable, with longer range. But American pilots were learning that the Wildcats' advantages could be exploited: rugged construction, heavy firepower, good dive speed. Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch, leading the Combat Air Patrol, employed tactics he'd developed called the Thatch Weave. When a Zero got on a Wildcat's tail, the targeted fighter would turn toward a wingman. As the Zero followed, the wingman could engage from the side, forcing the Zero to break off or be shot down. The tactics worked. American pilots shot down 14 Japanese aircraft for the loss of 11 F-4Fs. More importantly, they prevented the bombers from effectively attacking the transports. Only one transport, USS George F. Elliott, was severely damaged and later had to be scuttled. But the battle demonstrated something ominous. Japan could strike Guadalcanal from Rabaul. Until American fighters could operate from the captured airfield, the invasion fleet was vulnerable to air attack. On the beach, Marines were discovering what fighting in the tropics meant. The temperature exceeded 90 degrees with humidity near 100%. Fresh water was scarce. The jungle was impenetrable without machetes. And the insects were everywhere: mosquitoes, biting flies, ants, spiders, all of them aggressive and many carrying disease. Private Eugene Sledge, who would later write one of the most famous memoirs of the Pacific War, described that first day. The jungle was alive, not with Japanese, but with things that bit, stung, and crawled. We learned quickly that this place wanted to kill us just as much as the enemy did. As night fell on August 7th, 19,000 Marines dug foxholes in the volcanic soil and prepared for their first night in enemy territory. They'd accomplished the landing successfully. The airfield was secure, but the real battle for Guadalcanal hadn't begun yet. August 8th, 1942. 2330 hours. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's striking force approached Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer, steaming south through the slot between the Solomon Islands at 26 knots. Mikawa had been planning this attack for 24 hours, ever since receiving word of the American landing. His objective was simple: destroy the American transports before they could unload supplies, stranding the Marines on Guadalcanal without support. The American screening force protecting the transports consisted of 2 separate groups. The Southern Group, cruisers USS Australia, USS Canberra, USS Chicago, and destroyers. The Northern Group, cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and destroyers. Between these groups lay Savo Island, a volcanic cone rising from the sea. The Americans had positioned their forces to catch any Japanese ships approaching from the northwest. It was a reasonable defensive arrangement. What they didn't know was that Japanese night fighting doctrine was the most advanced in the world. Japanese sailors trained for months in night combat. Their ships carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo with a range of 20 miles and a warhead containing 1,000 pounds of high explosive. Their optical equipment was superior, and they possessed something American commanders didn't know existed: a tactical doctrine built around aggressive night surface action. At 0136 hours on August 9th, lookouts on the Japanese flagship Chokai spotted the American Southern Group. Mikawa had achieved complete tactical surprise. The American ships were still at low readiness, crews exhausted from days of general quarters, not expecting an attack. What followed was one of the worst defeats in United States Navy history. Mikawa's cruisers opened fire at 01:38 hours from just 4,900 yards. Star shells burst overhead, illuminating the American ships in harsh white light. Seconds later, main battery shells and torpedoes slammed into USS Canberra. The Australian cruiser was hit by 24 shells in less than 2 minutes. Fires erupted across her superstructure. Her engineering spaces flooded. Power failed. She went dead in the water, burning fiercely. USS Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew off her bow, but her captain, thinking the explosions were from shore batteries, turned away from the action instead of engaging. The Japanese formation split, racing past the southern group and heading for the Northern American cruisers. At 01:44 hours, they struck again. USS Quincy detected the Japanese ships and turned toward them, trying to bring her main battery to bear. She managed to get off several salvos before Japanese shells turned her into an inferno. One shell hit the bridge, killing the captain and most of the command staff. Fires spread through the superstructure. Torpedoes ripped open her hull. At 02:38, she rolled over and sank, taking 389 men with her. USS Vincennes lasted only slightly longer. Caught by searchlights and overwhelmed by gunfire from multiple Japanese cruisers, she burned from bow to stern. Her captain tried to beach her on Savo Island, but she sank at 02:50, with 332 men lost. USS Astoria took over 65 hits. Fires consumed her superstructure. Her crew fought to save her through the morning, but flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. She sank at 12:15 on August 9th. In 32 minutes of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk 4 Allied cruisers, damaged 2 others, and killed over 1,000 Allied sailors. Japanese losses: 58 dead, minor damage to 3 cruisers. It was the worst defeat the United States Navy had suffered in a fair fight since the War of 1812. Admiral Mikawa now faced a choice. His primary objective had been the transports. They were still there, just miles away, undefended. He could proceed and destroy them, stranding the Marines without supplies or reinforcements. But dawn was approaching. American carriers were somewhere in the area. Japanese aircraft couldn't reach Guadalcanal to provide air cover during daylight. If American dive bombers caught his force in daylight, the result could be catastrophic. Mikawa made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his force to retire, leaving the transports unmolested. As dawn broke on August 9th, the full scale of the disaster became clear to American forces. 4 cruisers gone, over 1,000 men dead. The invasion fleet was intact, but the psychological impact was devastating. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, made an immediate decision. His transports were undefended. Another Japanese attack could come at any moment. He would withdraw the fleet whether the unloading was complete or not. At 18:30 hours on August 9th, the transports steamed away from Guadalcanal, carrying with them much of the Marines' heavy equipment, construction materials, and supplies. Vandegrift's forces were left with ammunition for 4 days of fighting, food for 14 days, and no certainty of resupply. The 1st Marine Division was stranded on Guadalcanal with incomplete supplies, no air cover, and surrounded by enemy forces on all sides. The real battle was about to begin. August 10th, 1942. Morning. Major General Vandegrift surveyed his situation from his command post near the captured airfield. His Marines controlled approximately 5 square miles of Guadalcanal's total 2,060 square miles. They held the airfield and a perimeter extending roughly 7,000 yards along the coast and 2,000 yards inland. Outside this perimeter lay 90 miles of jungle, volcanic ridges, rivers, and swamps, all of it enemy territory. Intelligence estimated 2,000 Japanese defenders somewhere on the island. The actual number was closer to 3,000, and more were coming. The first priority was completing the airfield. Without air cover, the Marines were vulnerable to daily bombing raids from Rabaul. Japanese bombers came almost every day, usually around noon, earning them the nickname Tojo Time. Navy Construction Battalion personnel, the Seabees, worked alongside Marines to finish the runway. They labored under tropical sun, through daily air raids, racing to complete the 3,800-foot strip before the next Japanese attack. The perimeter defense had to be organized. Vandegrift positioned his forces in a rough semicircle around Lunga Point. The 5th Marine Regiment held the western sector. The 1st Marine Regiment covered the east. The 1st Pioneer Battalion, pressed into infantry service despite being construction troops, held sections of the line. The defense line followed natural features: rivers, ridges, swamps. Engineers strung barbed wire, dug machine gun positions, sighted artillery. The Marines learned to fight in conditions unlike anything they'd trained for. The jungle was the first enemy. It reduced visibility to yards. Movement was slow, exhausting, noisy. Radio communication was difficult. Maps were inaccurate. Units got lost within sight of their own lines. Then there were the diseases. Malaria was endemic. Within weeks, over half the Marines would contract it. Dysentery from contaminated water weakened men already struggling with inadequate rations. Tropical ulcers formed from the smallest scratch and refused to heal. Fungal infections attacked skin softened by constant moisture. "We were fighting 3 enemies," recalled Private Robert Leckie. "The Japanese, the jungle, and our own bodies. The jungle tried to swallow us. The diseases tried to rot us. And somewhere out there, the Japanese were planning to kill us." The Japanese, for their part, were equally shocked by the American landing. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had dismissed Guadalcanal as a minor outpost. Now American forces occupied the nearly completed airfield, threatening the entire Japanese position in the Solomons. The response was swift but disorganized. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, 2,000 men of the elite Sendai Division, was diverted from its planned assault on Midway Island and rushed to Guadalcanal. But instead of waiting for the entire regiment to arrive, Japanese commanders committed them piecemeal, confident that superior Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantages. It was a miscalculation that would cost thousands of Japanese lives. August 19, 1942. Colonel Ichiki landed with the first echelon of his regiment, 917 men, at Taivu Point, 25 miles east of the American perimeter. His orders were to probe American defenses and determine their strength. But Ichiki, a veteran of combat in China, believed American Marines would collapse under a determined night assault. He marched his force west along the coast, planning to strike the American eastern perimeter at the Ilu River, mistakenly identified on American maps as the Tenaru River. Marine patrols detected the Japanese approach on August 19th. Captain Charles Brush, leading a patrol from the 1st Marines, encountered Ichiki's advance guard at Coley Point. The firefight that erupted killed 34 Japanese and left Brush with vital intelligence. A large Japanese force was approaching the perimeter. Vandegrift immediately reinforced the eastern perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, held the line at the Tenaru sandbar. Machine guns were positioned with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was registered on likely approach routes. Barbed wire was strung across the sandbar. At 0130 hours on August 21st, the Japanese attacked. Ichiki committed his entire force in a frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese soldiers charged in massed formation, bayonets fixed, officers leading with swords drawn, screaming "Banzai!" as they rushed the Marine positions. The Marines opened fire with everything they had. Browning machine guns, firing 500 rounds per minute, swept the sandbar with intersecting fire. Mortars dropped high explosive shells into the packed Japanese formations. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired over open sights directly into the attacking waves. The slaughter was absolute. Japanese soldiers fell in heaps on the sandbar. Some made it across, only to be killed in hand-to-hand fighting. The Marines, firing from covered positions, suffered minimal casualties while inflicting devastating losses. The attack continued through the night. Ichiki threw wave after wave against the Marine positions, certain that superior Japanese fighting spirit would prevail. Each wave was destroyed by concentrated fire. As dawn broke, Vandegrift committed his reserves. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines crossed the Tenaru upstream and attacked the Japanese from behind, while tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion forded the river and attacked from the flank. The Japanese, caught in a three-sided trap with the ocean at their backs, fought with suicidal determination. They refused to surrender, fighting until killed or committing suicide rather than accept capture. By 1700 hours on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of Ichiki's 917 men, 774 were killed. The Marines suffered 35 dead. It was a kill ratio of 22.1, a level of one-sided slaughter rarely seen in military history. Colonel Ichiki, his attack force destroyed, burned his regimental colors, and committed ritual suicide. The battle provided several critical lessons. First, Japanese infantry tactics, effective against Chinese forces in the 1930s, were suicidal against American firepower. Second, Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, meaning every battle would be a war of annihilation. Third, American Marines could defeat Japanese forces when properly positioned and supplied. But the victory came with ominous realization. Ichiki's force was just the first. Intelligence indicated the rest of his regiment was still at sea, approaching Guadalcanal. And behind them, an entire division. The Kawaguchi Brigade, 6,000 veteran troops who had conquered Borneo and Java. The Japanese weren't going to give up Guadalcanal without a fight. They were going to reinforce it heavily and keep attacking until they either retook the airfield or destroyed the American garrison. August 20th, 1942, 1600 hours. The roar of Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines echoed across the completed airfield as 19 F-4F Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 touched down on Guadalcanal. Behind them came 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 232. The Marines on the ground cheered until their throats were hoarse. After 2 weeks of daily bombing raids with no ability to strike back, they finally had their own air power. The airfield was christened Henderson Field, named after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The name would become legendary in aviation history. Major John L. Smith commanded VMF 223. His pilots were young, mostly fresh from flight training, but they were about to receive combat education in the most brutal school imaginable. The Japanese would attack Henderson Field every single day for the next 4 months. The first test came within hours. Japanese bombers from Rabaul approached at 1200 hours the next day, expecting their usual unopposed run. Instead, they were intercepted by Smith's Wildcats. The dogfight that erupted over Guadalcanal proved what many had suspected. Japanese aircraft had significant advantages. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, with longer range. But American pilots were learning to exploit the Wildcats' advantages: rugged construction, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. Captain Marion Carl, who would become one of the top Marine aces, described the tactics. You couldn't turn with the Zero. It would outturn you every time. But you could outdive it, and you could take hits that would blow a Zero apart. The key was boom and zoom. Dive on them, fire, and keep diving. Never get slow. Never try to dogfight. The Cactus Air Force, as Henderson Field's aircraft came to be known after Guadalcanal's code name, developed into one of the most effective air units in the Pacific. Operating from a dirt strip that turned to mud when it rained, with limited fuel, spare parts salvaged from wrecks, and maintenance performed in the open under threat of bombing, they still managed to achieve air superiority over Guadalcanal. But their primary mission wasn't shooting down Japanese aircraft. It was stopping Japanese reinforcements. The Japanese developed a reinforcement system that exploited their one key advantage: naval superiority at night. Fast destroyer squadrons would race down the Slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, arrive at Guadalcanal after dark, offload troops and supplies in minutes, then race back up the slot before dawn brought American air power. The Marines called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it the Rat Run. It was devastatingly effective. Every few nights, Japanese destroyers would appear off Guadalcanal, shells screaming into the marine perimeter, troops splashing ashore, supplies being stacked on beaches. Then they'd vanish into darkness before Henderson Field's aircraft could react. The system allowed Japan to reinforce Guadalcanal without exposing their transports to daytime air attack. By early September, over 6,000 Japanese troops were on the island, with more arriving nightly. The Cactus Air Force tried everything to stop the express. Night fighters attempted interception, usually unsuccessfully. PBY Catalinas dropped flares to illuminate targets. PT boats attacked with torpedoes, occasionally scoring hits but taking heavy losses. The Japanese reinforcement schedule was relentless. On September 1st, 1,000 troops landed. September 4th, 1,200 more. September 8th, another 1,000. The Marines could hear them at night, landing beyond artillery range, singing as they marched into the jungle. Intelligence indicated a major Japanese offensive was coming. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, studied the terrain and identified the most likely attack route: a grassy ridge running south from the jungle directly toward Henderson Field. Edson requested permission to occupy this ridge with his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion. Vandegrift approved. What followed would become the most desperate battle in Marine Corps history. September 12, 1942. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's plan was elegant in its simplicity. His 6,000-man brigade would attack from 3 directions simultaneously. One force would strike from the west, another from the east. But the main assault, 3,000 men, would attack from the south, directly up that grassy ridge toward Henderson Field. The plan assumed American defenses would be weak in the south, focused on the coast. It assumed the thick jungle would conceal Japanese movements. Most critically, it assumed Japanese soldiers' superior fighting spirit would overcome American firepower. All 3 assumptions were wrong. Edson had positioned his 840 raiders and parachutists on and around the ridge. He knew they were outnumbered. He knew a major attack was coming. He didn't know when or exactly where, but he'd chosen his ground carefully. The ridge was about 1,000 yards long, running roughly north-south, covered in kunai grass that grew chest-high. It offered clear fields of fire and good artillery coverage. If his men could hold it, the Japanese would die trying to take it. If they lost it, Henderson Field would be under direct infantry assault. September 12th passed quietly. Too quietly. Marines on the ridge felt the tension building. Something was coming. At 2100 hours, Japanese destroyers offshore opened bombardment. Shells screamed into the marine perimeter. Then the first ground attack came, probing the southern perimeter, testing American responses. Edson's men beat it back, but heavier attacks followed. By midnight, full-scale assaults were hammering the ridge from multiple directions. Japanese infantry charged through the grass, screaming, "Banzai! Marines die!" Officers led with drawn swords. Machine gun fire and mortar shells tore into the Marine positions. The Marines gave ground slowly, falling back from one position to another, trading space for Japanese lives. But the attacks kept coming. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry, attacking with fanatical determination, absorbing casualties that would have broken any Western army. By 0200 hours on September 13th, the situation was critical. The Japanese had pushed to within yards of Henderson Field. One more determined push might break through. Edson walked the line, voice calm despite chaos, rallying his exhausted men. "This is it," he told them. "There's nowhere else to go. If we lose this ridge, we lose Henderson Field. If we lose Henderson Field, we lose Guadalcanal. You want to go home? You kill every Japanese bastard who comes up this hill." The Marines held. Barely. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, shells landing just yards in front of Marine positions. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. When ammunition ran low, Marines threw grenades. When grenades ran out, they fixed bayonets. Dawn on September 13th revealed the carnage. Dead Japanese soldiers lay in heaps on the slopes. Some had gotten within 20 yards of Marine positions before being killed. The kunai grass was flattened, torn apart by bullets and explosions, soaked in blood. But the Japanese weren't finished. They attacked again that night, September 13th of 14th. Again, waves of infantry charged up the ridge. Again, Marines held on through desperation and firepower. For 2 nights, the battle raged. For 2 nights, the Marines held a position they had no right to hold against an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1. When the sun rose on September 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge was over. General Kawaguchi, his brigade shattered, withdrew into the jungle. He'd lost over 1,200 men killed. The Marines lost 59 dead, 204 wounded. The ridge was renamed in Edson's honor. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during those desperate nights. But the real significance went beyond individual heroism. The Japanese had thrown their best troops against American Marines in a situation that favored the attackers. They'd achieved tactical surprise, held numerical superiority, and fought with desperate courage, and they'd been decisively defeated. It was the moment the myth of Japanese invincibility died. American forces could not only defend, they could win offensive engagements against Japan's finest troops. While Marines fought for the ridges and jungle around Henderson Field, the Navy waged its own desperate campaign in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. Between August and November 1942, these waters would see some of the most savage naval combat in history. The Tokyo Express continued operating almost nightly. Japanese destroyers raced down the slot, bombarded Henderson Field, landed troops and supplies, then raced back. American forces tried everything to stop them, usually unsuccessfully. On the night of October 11th-12th, Rear Admiral Norman Scott finally intercepted a Tokyo Express run. In the Battle of Cape Esperance, American cruisers and destroyers surprised Japanese ships off Guadalcanal's northwest coast. Scott's force achieved tactical surprise, opening fire first and sinking 1 Japanese cruiser and 1 destroyer. But the battle devolved into chaos as ships on both sides maneuvered in darkness, firing at anything that moved. 1 American destroyer was sunk by friendly fire. Another was crippled. Still, it was an American victory, the first surface action won by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, at least temporarily. American morale soared. It wouldn't last. On the night of October 13th-14th, Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, steamed into Ironbottom Sound. For 90 minutes, they bombarded Henderson Field with 14-inch shells. Over 900 shells, each weighing 400 pounds, slammed into the airfield. The bombardment was the most concentrated naval gunfire experienced by American forces in the entire war. Aircraft were blown apart. Fuel dumps exploded. The runway was cratered. Buildings were demolished. 48 aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 41 men were killed. Marines huddled in foxholes as the world exploded around them. The noise was beyond description. Continuous thunder that went on, shock waves that stopped hearts, dirt and debris raining down between explosions. "I thought the world was ending," recalled one Marine. "The explosions were so close together it was one continuous roar. The ground shook like an earthquake. I prayed I wouldn't die, then prayed that if I had to die, it would be quick." Dawn revealed devastation. Henderson Field was a moonscape of craters and wreckage, but incredibly the strip was still operational. Seabees and Marines worked frantically, filling craters, salvaging aircraft, restoring capability. By afternoon, patched-together aircraft were flying again. The Cactus Air Force refused to die. October 23, 1942. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army, had arrived on Guadalcanal with reinforcements bringing Japanese strength to approximately 20,000 troops. He planned a three-pronged offensive that would finally overwhelm the American defenders. The Japanese had learned from previous failures. This time they would coordinate attacks from multiple directions. They would use their superior numbers. They would attack at night when American firepower was less effective. The plan was solid. The execution would prove catastrophic. The main assault would come from the south again, but this time with an entire division. The 2nd Sendai Division, 7,000 men. Another force would attack from the east across the Tenaru River. A third would strike from the jungle to the west. The offensive began on October 23rd with a diversionary attack on the Tenaru. The Japanese were repulsed with heavy losses, but this was just the opening move. On October 24th-25th, the main assault crashed into the southern perimeter at positions held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller was already a legend in the Marine Corps. A veteran of Nicaragua and Haiti, he'd earned 4 Navy Crosses before arriving on Guadalcanal. He was about to earn his 5th. His battalion held a 2,500-yard section of jungle perimeter south of Henderson Field. Intelligence had warned him the attack was coming. He'd positioned his men carefully, machine guns sighted for interlocking fire, artillery registered on likely approach routes, reserves positioned for counterattacks. At 2200 hours on October 24th, Japanese artillery opened fire. Then the infantry came. The 2nd Sendai Division attacked in waves, thousands of men charging through the jungle in darkness. They came screaming, firing, throwing grenades, dying in incredible numbers and still coming. Puller's Marines held their positions and fired. Machine guns hammered away until barrels glowed. Mortars dropped shells as fast as crews could load. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired continuously, sometimes so close that shrapnel wounded Marines in their own positions. The Japanese attacked all night. Wave after wave broke against Puller's lines. Bodies piled up in front of Marine positions. Still they came. At one point, Japanese troops broke through a gap in the line. Puller personally led a counterattack, rallying cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle, and drove them back. "Great God Almighty!" he shouted over the chaos. "They're coming at us from every direction. We'll have to fight our way out in the morning." But morning came, and the Marines still held their positions. The Japanese withdrew, leaving over 2,000 dead. Puller's battalion had suffered 70 casualties but stopped an entire division. The attacks continued for 3 more nights. Each night, the Japanese threw everything they had at the Marine perimeter. Each night, they were repulsed with catastrophic losses. By October 27th, the 2nd Sendai Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Of 7,000 men committed to the offensive, over 3,500 were dead. The survivors were scattered through the jungle, starving, exhausted, defeated. The October offensive had been Japan's last realistic chance to retake Guadalcanal. They'd committed their best troops, achieved surprise in timing if not location, and fought with desperate courage. And they'd been decisively defeated. American casualties were significant. 86 Marines killed, over 200 wounded. But the kill ratio was nearly 40.1 in favor of the defenders. Japanese commanders began to understand that they weren't facing the demoralized American forces they'd expected. They were fighting Marines who refused to break, supported by artillery and air power that turned every attack into a slaughter. The turning point on land was matched by an equally decisive confrontation at sea. The Japanese hadn't given up. If they couldn't take Henderson Field by ground assault, they would destroy it from the sea and starve the garrison into submission. November 12, 1942. Intelligence reported a massive Japanese naval force approaching. 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, 14 destroyers, carrying 13,500 troops for another ground offensive. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded the American force sent to intercept, 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but there was no choice. If the Japanese force reached Guadalcanal, it was over. The two fleets collided in Ironbottom Sound on the night of November 12th or 13th in what became known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It was the most savage surface action in U.S. Navy history. The battle began at 01:48 hours when the opposing forces literally ran into each other in darkness. Ships opened fire at point-blank range, sometimes less than 1,000 yards. Searchlights stabbed through the night. Tracers streaked in every direction. Torpedoes crossed the water. Ships exploded, burned, sank. The American destroyer USS Laffey closed to within 20 feet of the Japanese battleship Hiei and fired her 5-inch guns directly into the battleship's superstructure before being blown apart by return fire. Admiral Callahan's flagship, the cruiser USS San Francisco, engaged Hiei in a gunnery duel at less than 3,000 yards. The battleship's 14-inch shells tore into the cruiser. One shell hit the bridge, killing Callahan and most of his staff. But San Francisco kept firing, landing over 45 hits on Hiei. The battle lasted just 24 minutes of pure chaos. When it ended, 2 American cruisers were sinking. 4 destroyers were gone. Admiral Callahan and Admiral Norman Scott were both dead. Over 1,400 American sailors had been killed. But the Japanese had been stopped. Hiei was so badly damaged she couldn't escape before dawn. Aircraft from Henderson Field found her at first light and sent her to the bottom with bombs and torpedoes. 2 Japanese destroyers were sunk. The troop convoy turned back. Most critically, the Japanese had failed to bombard Henderson Field or land their troops. The American ships had sacrificed themselves to save the airfield. 2 nights later, on November 14th-15th, the Japanese tried again. The battleship Kirishima, with cruisers and destroyers, steamed toward Guadalcanal to bombard Henderson Field. This time they met the battleship USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Washington's 16-inch guns destroyed Kirishima in just 7 minutes of firing. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships in 3 days, casualties they could never replace. But the most decisive action came during daylight on November 14th. Japanese Admiral Raizo Tanaka, determined to land reinforcements despite losses, pushed ahead with 11 transports escorted by destroyers. Aircraft from Henderson Field found them at dawn. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked continuously throughout the day. By evening, 7 transports were sinking or sunk. 4 damaged transports beached themselves, but Henderson Field's aircraft destroyed them and their cargoes the next day. Of 13th E-500 troops embarked for Guadalcanal, only 4,000 made it ashore, without heavy equipment, vehicles, or adequate supplies. They staggered into the jungle to join thousands of other Japanese soldiers who were slowly starving to death. The naval battle of Guadalcanal marked the turning point in the campaign. Japan had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 transports, and 64 aircraft. They would never again attempt a major reinforcement of Guadalcanal. December 1942 through January 1943 saw the campaign shift from desperate defense to grinding attrition. The Marines had been reinforced by Army units, the 25th Infantry Division, the 2nd Marine Division, and the Americal Division. American strength on Guadalcanal exceeded 50,000 troops. Japanese strength was officially 25,000, but most were starving, diseased, and combat ineffective. The Tokyo Express still ran occasionally, but now it was evacuating the sick and wounded rather than landing fresh troops. The Japanese situation on Guadalcanal was beyond desperate. Cut off from supplies, they ate grass, roots, tree bark. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Soldiers too weak to walk lay in the jungle waiting to die. Desperate men resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead to stay alive. One Japanese soldier's diary, recovered after the war, described the horror. November 30th. No food for 5 days. Men are eating leather. December 4th. Ito died last night. We ate what we could. December 9th. Only 12 men left in our company. December 15th. I am the last. I have no strength to bury the others. I will join them soon. American forces began offensive operations to clear Japanese troops from the island. The 25th Infantry Division pushed west along the coast. The 2nd Marine Division attacked inland. Progress was slow, measured in yards per day through jungle and swamps, but relentless. The Japanese fought for every position with desperate courage. They knew they were beaten. They knew no relief was coming. Still, they fought, often refusing to surrender even when surrounded and starving. Major General Alexander Patch replaced Vandegrift as commander in December. His orders were clear. Destroy all Japanese forces on Guadalcanal and secure the entire island. The final major engagement came in mid-January when American forces trapped a large concentration of Japanese troops near Cape Esperance on the northwestern tip of the island. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination, launching banzai charges against American positions, dying almost to the last man rather than surrender. But unknown to American forces, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had finally accepted reality. Guadalcanal was lost. On December 31, 1942, Emperor Hirohito authorized the evacuation of surviving Japanese forces. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal was among the most difficult in Japanese military history. It meant admitting defeat, abandoning territory, accepting that the Americans had stopped their expansion. But the alternative was watching 25,000 soldiers die slowly of starvation. The evacuation, codenamed Operation K, would attempt something unprecedented: extract thousands of troops from an island surrounded by enemy forces. The operation required deceiving American intelligence into thinking Japan was reinforcing rather than evacuating. Destroyers would make high-speed runs to Guadalcanal, but instead of landing troops, they would evacuate them. The first evacuation run came on the night of February 1, 1943. 20 destroyers raced down the slot, reached Cape Esperance, and evacuated 5,000 troops in less than an hour before racing back. American commanders, expecting another reinforcement attempt, were baffled when intelligence reported no new Japanese troops on the island. It took days to realize what was happening. On February 4th and 7th, more evacuation runs rescued additional troops. By February 8th, over 11,000 Japanese soldiers had been evacuated. Thousands more had died in the jungle, killed by starvation, disease, and American attacks. American forces didn't realize the Japanese were gone until February 9th, when patrols reached Cape Esperance and found it abandoned. The sick, the wounded, those too weak to walk, had been left behind to die. But Japan had successfully evacuated most of their remaining combat-effective troops. It was a masterful operation, executed under impossible conditions. But it was still a retreat, still a defeat, still an acknowledgement that Guadalcanal belonged to America. February 9th, 1943. Major General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. American forces controlled the entire island. Henderson Field, expanded and improved, now served as a major air base for operations up the Solomon Island chain. The Japanese would never threaten Australia again. The statistics told a story of savage warfare. American casualties: 1,600 killed on land, 4,900 killed at sea, over 4,200 wounded. Japanese casualties: approximately 24,000 dead from all causes, including combat, disease, and starvation. At sea, Japan lost 24 warships, including 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The U.S. Navy lost 24 warships, including 2 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Both sides lost approximately 600 aircraft, but America could replace losses. Japan couldn't. Each experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Each ship sunk represented capacity that couldn't be restored. More significantly, Guadalcanal destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility. American forces had attacked Japanese-held territory and won. They'd defeated Japan's best troops in jungle warfare. They'd outfought the Imperial Navy in savage surface actions. They'd established air superiority over Japanese-controlled waters. The campaign proved that American industrial capacity could overwhelm Japanese tactical excellence, that American Marines could defeat Japanese soldiers, that America had the will to fight a long, brutal war in the Pacific until Japan was defeated. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end. After 6 months of fighting, they'd lost their first major territory. They'd been forced into strategic defense. The initiative had passed to America, never to return. Guadalcanal transformed the U.S. Marine Corps from a pre-war force of 28,000 into the elite amphibious assault force that would island hop across the Pacific. The lessons learned in those jungles and ridges were written into doctrine, taught to every Marine who followed. The campaign established patterns that would repeat across the Pacific. American forces would seize Japanese-held islands, endure counterattacks, defend until overwhelming force could be concentrated, then advance. Each island would be another Guadalcanal, brutal, costly, but ultimately victorious. For the Navy, the waters around Guadalcanal became a laboratory for night-fighting tactics. The early disasters led to improved radar, better communications, aggressive tactics that would make the U.S. Navy dominant in surface actions by war's end. The Cactus Air Force became the model for marine aviation. Operating from austere conditions, maintaining aircraft with salvaged parts, flying until exhaustion, they proved that small numbers of determined aviators could achieve air superiority against numerically superior opponents. Veterans of Guadalcanal formed the core of leadership that would carry America through the rest of the war. Basilone would die on Iwo Jima after earning the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. Puller would go on to become the most decorated Marine in history. Edson would command Marines in later campaigns. The lessons they learned in blood on Guadalcanal would save countless lives in battles yet to come. The Solomons campaign that began with Guadalcanal would continue for 2 more years. American forces would fight their way up the island chain, New Georgia, Bougainville, eventually isolating the major Japanese base at Rabaul without assaulting it. Each battle built on lessons from Guadalcanal. August 7, 1942. 19,000 Marines landed on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. They came ashore expecting disaster. Instead, they began America's transformation from victim of aggression to vengeful juggernaut. For 6 months, they held a perimeter against an enemy that should have overwhelmed them. They endured daily bombing, nightly naval bombardment, constant ground attacks. They fought in jungles that rotted their bodies. They survived on half rations while diseases claimed more casualties than combat. But they held, and in holding, they proved something to themselves, to their enemy, and to the world. America could fight. America could win. America would not stop until the Pacific was free. Guadalcanal was where the defensive war ended and the offensive war began, where American industrial might began translating into battlefield victory, where the long road to Tokyo really started. The island's importance can't be overstated. If Japan had completed that airfield, if they'd held Guadalcanal, the war might have lasted years longer. Australia might have been isolated. The entire strategic situation in the Pacific would have favored Japan. Instead, American Marines seized it, held it, and transformed it into a base for future operations. They proved that Japan could be beaten, that American forces could conduct offensive operations in the Pacific, that the rising sun was setting. The waters around Guadalcanal, called Ironbottom Sound, for the dozens of ships resting on the bottom, stand as testament to the savage nature of the campaign. Both sides paid in blood for every yard of jungle, every mile of ocean, every day of fighting. But when it ended, America held the island. Japan's advance was stopped. The counteroffensive had begun. 70,000 American troops would serve on Guadalcanal during the campaign. They came as untested soldiers and left as veterans of the Pacific War's most crucial battle. They'd proven that American forces could not only defend against Japanese attacks, but could seize and hold Japanese territory. The Japanese military would never recover from Guadalcanal. The cream of their infantry died in those jungles. Their naval losses couldn't be replaced. Their best pilots fell over those waters. After Guadalcanal, Japan fought a defensive war, trying desperately to hold what remained of their empire. America, by contrast, gained momentum. Production increased, training improved, tactics evolved. Each subsequent battle would be harder for Japan, easier for America, as the industrial and manpower advantages of the United States ground Japan toward inevitable defeat. But it all started on Guadalcanal, on that remote island, where Marines landed uncertain of victory and left having changed the course of the war. The campaign produced 5 medals of honor, dozens of Navy crosses, hundreds of acts of extraordinary heroism that went unrecognized except by the men who witnessed them. It produced legends who would lead American forces for the rest of the war. Most importantly, it produced victory. America's first major offensive victory of World War II. The first step on the road that would end at Tokyo Bay in September 1945. Today, Guadalcanal is a peaceful island in the independent nation of Solomon Islands. The airfield still operates, now called Honiara International Airport. The jungles have reclaimed most battle sites, but monuments remain. Memorials to Marines who fell at the Tenaru, plaques marking where Edson's Ridge was defended, the wrecks in Ironbottom Sound visible from the air. And for those who served there, Guadalcanal remains the defining moment of their lives. The place where boys became men, where men became heroes, where America became the power that would win the Pacific War. When they landed on August 7, 1942, success was uncertain. When they left months later, victory was inevitable. That's the legacy of Guadalcanal. That's why it matters. The first major offensive of World War II, the battle that stopped Japan, the campaign that proved America could fight and win. Guadalcanal, where the tide turned and the long march to victory began.